Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2026 Trends Guide Live today. We're thrilled to have you, and we've got a lot of information to cover, so we're looking forward to having a robust conversation. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items to ensure a smooth experience for everybody. If you have any questions for the speakers, please submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical issues, please let us know through the chat function located at the bottom of your screen. A recording of our webinar will be emailed to all attendees within 7 days. So now that we've got that out of the way, I'm excited to introduce myself, John Saad, President of Guidehouse, as well as my colleagues who will be joining us for today's discussion. Stuart Brown, our Global Technology Leader, John Morris, our Global Health Leader, Chris O'Brien, who leads our Communities, Energy, and Infrastructure team globally, and Shannon White, who is our Global Defense and Security Leader. The 2026 Trends Guide was developed through in-depth interviews with Guidehouse leaders and advisors across our global network. These experts brought forward real-world insights grounded in their direct work with government and commercial clients across industries. And today you'll get a chance to hear from them as we go into some more detail. So what is the 2026 Trends Guide? Today, we're going to take a closer look that really encompasses a suite of 5 different reports that we published at the start of February that were meant to serve as a directional outlook for the year ahead. We're now at the end of Q1, and it's about time to take a look back and do a pulse check to see how these trends are actually playing out in real time. One thing is clear, though, for leaders, it's no longer about adapting to one new thing. In 2026, leaders are navigating multiple shifts at once. So today's agenda, we're going to be walking you through a number of different things today. The overarching cross-industries trends we identified in the report, the early signals on what trends are tracking and is expected and which ones have deviated, what the evolution of those trends are. We're going to delve into some sector-specific implications that leaders should be watching for now across the energy provider space, financial services, government agencies, and healthcare. And of course, we'll leave some time at the end for some questions and answers. And again, feel free to add those to the chat as we go along, and we'll save those for the end and try to adjudicate that when we get to that stage of the discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into sort of the overarching trends and get some initial reactions from my colleagues on the call. Let's start by setting the scene. The 2026 Trends Guide starts off with a cross-industry report that highlights 4 forces that are influencing both public market conditions and dynamics and missions. These include partnerships without a playbook, talent pipelines, AI forces, and the transformation tipping point. So let's start back with partnerships without a playbook. National governments are stepping back from direct service delivery, leaving states, cities, and private players to navigate expanding demands, often without clear roles or shared incentives. Chris, I would like to get your take initially on what this means to you and the industries that you support. Then I'll kick it over to Shannon for her reactions.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everybody. This trend, actually, I think, in my world, working with the clients I serve in the utilities and energy industry, is really one of the most important ones. It's been evolving over the last couple of years, but what we're seeing now is that the challenges of delivering on the demand for energy that exists out in the world can't really be met by traditional energy provider organizations themselves. This was something we saw a year or two ago in the Biden administration when there was a big push towards renewables and things like hydrogen hubs became prominent. All sorts of different industries and consortia coming together to deliver hydrogen, and other renewables as well, solar and wind, but also, now, as that policy sort of orientation shifts a little bit, you're still seeing the same kind of thing with small modular reactors and other ways of satisfying the massive amount of demand that comes through. There's all these kinds of needs for innovative financing, for partners that might be able to participate, for much more collaborative interaction with regulators, especially at the local level. And this is a skill set that energy providers need to figure out how to incorporate and onboard. And it's one that is not necessarily going to be more or less in demand given policy shifts out in the world. It's a thing that's going to need to become a muscle that successful organizations cultivate.
Great. Shannon, what perspectives can you add around this partnerships without a playbook, understanding that testing accountability, building collaboration are imperatives now? What are you seeing from the public sector side?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And Chris, I know we're going to talk about the kind of intersection of national security and energy during this session, but I'd love to bring in emergency management. Just last week, Guidehouse's Emergency Management Center of Excellence co-hosted with the American Red Cross a symposium on emergency management, and the topic was building partnerships at the state and local level. And as you said, there's a real recognition that the federal government is stepping back, and that in the case of emergency management, it's paramount to build relationships and partnerships across a wider spectrum of constituencies, including state, local, territorial, tribal, academia, and the private sector. I do believe that they have shared incentives and that they recognize that it's necessary to not only have plans in place, but also partnerships in place before disasters strike.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. And yes, I think we're seeing this not only in the US, but globally around the sort of different relationship between the public and private sectors. John, I'm going to jump to you now to talk a little bit about talent pipelines and get your initial thoughts on this as we sort of put forward in our trends report around one of the industry forces that talent pipelines are facing a low flow, fewer junior hires leading to potential capability gaps. Maybe some of your perspectives on that broadly and in the health space in specifically.
John, I think this is one where the jury's still out. A lot of the press that you would have read 6 months ago talked about this exact trend. It's one that we were experiencing and hearing about from our clients. And now in recent weeks, you hear that maybe there's going to be an oversupply of jobs. And I think what's happening, just like with any technology change that's taken place over the last 50 years, there's just a rebalancing with regard to where the talent pool is going to go. And that's what we need to be watching, is the places where, sure, there's going to be a reduction in talent in one space, but that'll create a need for talent in other spaces. And I think that's what we see emerging in this space.
Great. Yeah, thanks, John. I think you're right. There's a lot of whiplash going on in terms of how companies and governments are reacting, whether or not they should be changing their org models from pyramids to diamonds and things, and sort of what that flow of talent that will matriculate through the organization will look like. Definitely something we'll delve into further as we get into the industry deep dives. I'm going to take the last two of these 4 cross-cutting industry forces and ask Stuart to comment on them, both the AI driving system level changes and transformation reaching a tipping point. I see that there's a lot of interplay between these two with our clients and stakeholders that we interact with regularly. Stu, what are some of your thoughts around the dynamics of those two forces?
Yeah, thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. I think, what John and Shannon and Chris and talked about is right there, which is organizations are seeing a transformation tipping point. I mean, we're seeing it across the board. We're used to doing big bang transformation, whether it was old ERP systems or other big things that were big things that we had time to get to. Now we're seeing constant drumbeat of smaller everyday changes, and it's a lot for an organization to absorb, especially as it changes day to day. And as our organizations aren't built for that. I think they're experiencing transformation fatigue a little bit. I think it's important that we understand that and help them understand what that's going to mean for their going forward, or the process, what that means for their jobs. Back to John's point, I mean, we flip-flop back and forth sometimes in what we hear in the press. As organizational leaders, we need to make sure we're setting a clear vision and prioritization that they can go against, shifting to some agile, constant, continuous operational model inside the organizations is new for us, as opposed to the big bang model. And it really comes down to strengthening change management within an organization. That means, number one, you need to help your employees get upskilled. I think it's really important. There is fear in organizations today around what this change means. And I think we need to flip the narrative from fear to excitement. And I think we can do that. We had more time to do that in the past. Today, we've got to do it much quicker. I think measurement of the impact across large scale changes and incremental changes is important. And I think we can do that in a more real-time way than we used to be able to do. So what I see is, like, the winners will build true organizational resilience. I think that's the key thing we've got to get to, which is taking that collision of constant reinvention and everyday shifts into sustainable competitive advantage, whether that's in serving a commercial environment or a regulated environment. I think this idea of how do we build that muscle inside our organization is one that a lot of leaders and frankly employees are challenged with. Back to you, John.
Thanks, Stu. And I think, just to put a capper on that, I think some of the things I heard you mention, and I think that came out through our analysis, was change agility versus change management, co-creation of these topics and items so that people feel like they're along for the journey instead of being dictated to. And the one point you mentioned in there, which I thought was really insightful, is making sure that there's alignment of the metrics, both the hard metrics and the soft metrics, on whether or not we're making progress. Excitement is key here, right? This shouldn't be scary. Change is inevitable, but how do you bring people along for the ride? So now we're going to go to our first polling question. We want to get all those that joined the webinar engaged here, and we want to pose a question to you. Of the forces that we've just discussed and sort of touched on lightly, which do you see having the greatest impact on your organizations in 2026? A pop-up box should show up on your screens, and then we'll give it a minute to see the answers come through. I don't know if I was allowed to participate, but I did because the box showed up there, but we're still getting the results coming in. Right now, though, I mean, there's an obvious, clear favorite item here. The rise of AI-enabled tools and workflows is what's standing out, and everything else is a distant second here. Right now, the one that's got the least sort of reaction is around increasing cyber threats. It's really interesting to see. You've done this poll 5 years ago. I think you would have got a quite different result, especially with regard to cyber threats. All right, well, we'll touch on this as we go through, but this confirms a lot of the discussion and the research that has been put forward on this. Okay, so now let's move to the sector pulse check. And we're going to start to go in, as you'll see, a series of deeper dives, and our experts will chime in on their views and thoughts as they see it from the industries that they serve. In this portion, we'd like to dive deeper, and we're going to do a little bit of a rapid fire in these sector by sector pulse checks to see how things are really unfolding. And we're going to start with energy providers. So the Energy Trends Report opens with a single word: unprecedented. This word reflects not just load growth, but the scale of simultaneous pressures on utilities, businesses, and operating models. Chris, as you look at Q1, what feels fundamentally different this year?
It's interesting. To me, things do feel very different, but they also feel quite familiar. Certainly, this is an unprecedented environment, and energy providers are facing what you could describe as an existential threat because, obviously when we wrote this trends guide a couple of months ago, we weren't in the middle of a conflict in the Middle East, and the strain on energy prices has only gotten worse. The challenges around affordability in the economy in general have only been heightened. So it does feel like a moment that is quite new and unique. I think that I would also say, though, that we have faced these kinds of existential shifts in the market before, and some of the things that we've done in the past are going to be useful, and we're going to need to develop some new ones as well. One of the things that obviously load growth is a thing that everybody is talking about, and it harkens back to this question around partnerships, and what we're seeing a lot is that that energy providers and non-traditional entrants are kind of coming together to figure out how to address this. Even energy providers working with individual homeowners to help supply power and energy to a broader grid. But there's financial players that are very involved. There's been a lot made of the sort of major hyperscalers and tech players becoming involved. So this load growth is creating a sort of this scramble to be able to fill it, and it harkens back to this notion of sort of the entities that are able to come together and find mutual interests are going to be the ones that are going to thrive. I think the questions around affordability, they tend to ebb and flow with sort of the overall economy. But I think what we're seeing now is that these questions will endure, and that, we're not just, sort of having an affordability crisis that comes from an overall economic crisis, but there are people's energy bills are rising, and there's a lot of scrutiny upon them, and it's become not only an issue for energy providers, but also for political folks. And that creates an environment where some decisions around this may not be made in the halls of utilities and energy provider organizations. They could be driven by other forces. And I think that's one that, again, speaks to this notion of partnerships and working with regulators and getting ahead of those things. The resiliency challenges, it's funny how this one takes a little bit of a backdrop given everything that's going on in the world, but they're actually all the more important. If you think of the sort of crunch in energy today driven by the conflict in the Middle East, there is, I think, a real view and a real understanding that driving towards more renewable sources of energy is a thing that would help those kinds of things in the future, when those shocks, when they emerge. But also, obviously, things like climate-driven events like wildfire and hurricanes, they are only getting more and more common. And this is where tech can really help to speed our response to those things and help us prepare for the future. Things like digital twins, using AI to be able to drive and to understand the impacts of things like wildfire when they're about ready to emerge, where they're likely to hit. I think these are things that that are nice use cases for AI. And I think this notion of the energy transition sort of at a paradigm shift, to me, it really again harkens back to this thing that we thought of the energy transition as being a shift away from carbon-based fuels or fossil fuels or things like that, and that is definitely true. But what we're also seeing is a transition in the way energy is developed and distributed, and I think that is actually the threat or the trend that's going to have the most impact on traditional energy providers going forward. So it is an era of sort of unprecedented change, but I do think that sort of focusing back on the things that we need to build to develop in order to get better, like sort of aligning with regulators and other regulated entities and private sector entities and even individual homeowners, is a way to developing that muscle to be able to create those partnerships are going to actually be part of the solution going forward.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of times throughout your comments artificial intelligence, AI. It clearly popped as the number one trending area for our webinar participants today. How is AI-driven demand changing the equation? What are some of the things that are going on in the industry? I mean, everybody is implementing this, from the halls of government to corporate boardrooms, massive demands. Energy needs abound because of the consumption. What are you seeing shift in the production and the availability to meet those needs?
I mean, obviously, every single day you hear of a new hyperscaler that's sort of coming up from a non-traditional place, or significant capital flowing to data center development. I think a lot has been made of that, and it's certainly something to watch very carefully, because yes, this demand needs to come online, but there are real sort of economic, political, and local considerations about doing that I think are really going to come into focus over the next several months as citizens, residents themselves actually weigh in on how they view this AI revolution and how it's affecting their communities. One other thing I would say on this, though, when I talk to executives at utilities or energy providers, there's this general sense that the professional services industry isn't really serving them very well on topics like AI. We tend to talk a lot about sort of the transformational effects of the AI capability in general, but what I think people really want to hear is specific use cases. How is this going to help my organization? I don't want to hear a lot of sort of, flashy lasers and kind of whiz bang types of technologies. I want to hear actually, how does this help me? How does this help me predict, sort of climate related events? How does this help me collect better from my consumers? How does this help me find people to enroll in customer programs and get them on board? So I think our job at Guidehouse, what we really focus on, is helping executives think through not the hype of AI, but how it actually can be used. Because we've seen this movie before. When a big technology comes online, there's a big hype curve where everybody talks about it, and then there's a fall off. And what gets left in the dust of that is the organizations that really can think about how you apply this specific kind of technology to real world business and consumer needs. I think that's where Guidehouse is looking to step in and and help clients figure out how to manage that transition.
Got it. And one final one, some quick thoughts on this one so we can dive into the next segment. Shannon mentioned in her opening remarks sort of our collaboration around emergency management with entities like the American Red Cross and the need for more resilient infrastructure. With the surging demands, extreme weather, affordability concerns, what should utilities be prioritizing to stay resilient and responsive in the months to come?
And obviously, the ability to bring on more capacity when needed is gonna be just the key focus, and figuring out how and where that comes from is a thing that everybody is thinking about. I do think that the traditional focus on customer programs is going to be really important too, helping customers figure out how to take advantage of tools and incentives to manage their bills, but also to help them figure out when and how to consume energy most efficiently. That's something that state and local and energy providers have come together on in the past, and I think that's going to be something that's really prominent as well. And again, I sort of mentioned this earlier, I do think that this sort of individual connection between the energy provider and the homeowner or the business as specific entities is going to be critical. Figuring out who pays for these kinds of enhancements and improvements, who bears the weight of the affordability crisis. In a lot of ways, there are big corporate entities that are pushing or driving towards sort of more capacity that's raising costs. So how do you create a rate case that effectively bills the people appropriately for the impacts of that? And I think that's something that a lot of executives are looking at as well.
Great. Chris, thanks for your insights. We'll come back to you shortly on some more rapid fire round robin when we get to the later part of the agenda. But now we're going to switch gears and talk about the sector pulse check for financial services. Stu, I'm going to throw you a few questions to get your insight. A lot of what we're seeing is a AI transformation in this sector. But what are you starting to see from this leap from pilots to production that we talk about in the trends reports? Where are you seeing the biggest AI impacts in the financial services sector today?
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think, similar to what Chris was saying, we're seeing a big change in sort of past the hype curve when it comes to AI, right? So we're going from the end of the AI pilot purgatory. I don't think we're talking bespoke use cases anymore. Institutions are starting looking at what does AI core production mean at an enterprise value level, not just experiments. And that's nowhere is that more telling than in the financial services business, where you have a very data-centric, process-oriented industry, which can take high advantage of AI, but there's a lot of key things to think through as we go down that path. Number one is risk and fraud detection, right? Obviously, the attack vector goes up, but also the protect vector goes up even more. And that's the piece, we always hear the doom and gloom when it comes to AI, but I think real-time pattern recognition have the ability to deliver like 70% reductions in false positives when it comes to risk and fraud detection. That's one area we're obviously very deep in at Guidehouse, and we see a lot of that in the services we provide. And the advantage to be able to get to the real threat quicker, leveraging AI-generated protection will allow us to protect ourselves against the AI-generated threats like deepfakes and others. So that's really important, number one. I think number two is the compliance and regulatory operations. This obviously really important for the financial services industry, as it is for most regulated industries. I think looking at automated KYC and AML is important. Surveillance, reporting, to be able to get speed to audits. These are things that took a lot of time in the past, which we can accelerate by leveraging AI in the right ways. And so when we talk about agentic, I know that's a term that everybody has their own definition towards, but we really think about the ability to have 24/7 agents sitting next to our auditors to be able to get to that answer much faster and to be more compliant and make sure we're following regulatory guidelines is really transformative. So those are two big areas. Let's talk to the customer side. I think customer experience and personalization is important. We're getting to the world of hyper personalization. No longer do you just get offered the generic thing because you have X amount of dollars in your account, or you have X amount of dollars when you come to your wealth fund or insurance. You're going to start getting very hyper personalized onboarding experience, advice, product recommendations, and others that is going to feel very specific and natural to you and your needs, whether it's an individual or a family. So this is when we're going to see, we're seeing to really start to explode. If you look in the insurance industry with insurance companies like Lemonade and others, is it really different behind the scenes? No, it's the front end piece that's different. It's very hyper personalized. You're getting an insurance policy that's defined for you and how you drive and other things. So you see that with the ability to offer a 50% lower insurance if you're using full self-driving versus human driving. Right? That's something that's very personalized and very real time. And last is operational efficiency. Obviously, within these organizations, end-to-end automation is critical for back office process. We know that. When it comes to reconciliation and other things, that's key. So success requires strong governance to manage things like bias, hallucinations, and other things that deal with regulatory risk. But the winners will be measured, as you talked about earlier, in ROI, right? How do you measure what this is, not just model accuracy? So I think it's no longer a side project. I think it's becoming an engine. And I think that's the piece we'll see in 26.
Great insight. So now that we've sort of laid out what we're going to see, what do you see as foundational investments that are proving essential for AI to truly perform at scale across, our financial services clients and other entities that are involved in this?
Yeah, and not to scare people with this word, but I think scaling AI systems demand system reckoning. What does that mean? Modernizing where it makes sense, containerizing where it also makes sense. We're not going to modernize, because your data foundations here are critical. So number one is data foundations. Clear, governed, real-time data pipelines and data lakes are important. If you have fragmented legacy data, that's going to be the biggest blocker to getting value, and also could be potentially your biggest risk. But that trapped data you have in your organization is your value prop. That's what the company is. That is your persona. How do you unlock that data within your organization? I think infrastructure, like, scalable cloud hybrid platforms, compute GPUs, which is going to be more and more important. I mean, NVIDIA used to not be something we talked about inside the corporate walls or inside the regulatory walls. You're going to be running your own compute GPUs. So what does that mean? I think I think financial services is ahead of the game here because of the models they're trying to run, and they don't want those models outside of their four walls. So actually on-prem is becoming a thing again for certain data sets and certain model runs. So I think that's important. So it's got to be reliable and you got to monitor it. So data foundations, infrastructure, governance and risk frameworks. You got to model the risk management. It's got to be explainable. You got to have bias audits. You got to have humans in the loop, and you've got to continually test it. The good thing with AI is you continually test it. There's a concept in the world of AI development called specification engineering. It's something we're pushing really hard here at Guidehouse. You write specs for individuals, you write specs for programs. You should also write specs for models and AI, so that number one is you're continuously testing against those specs, but you should also have then golden specs that you continuously test it against to make sure its answers haven't changed. And last is the talent operating model. This is the most important. Cross-functional teams, we got to get rid of the silos. We need organizational AI literacy. I talked about that earlier. And then obviously that needs to be wrapped in a secure core. There's going to be a lot of competitors that are coming after the bigger players that are going to spin up in this AI world, and it's going to be really interesting to see.
Awesome. Okay, now one quick hitter for you, although I'm not sure how this could be quick, but you'll do your best. Hot topic. Quantum computing is forcing a redefinition of cyber resilience. How are forward-looking financial institutions preparing for encryption breaking that could compromise decades of data?
Yeah, I'll try to do as quick as I can. Number one is you need to be preparing now. You can't wait. That's number one. And we do a lot of that with our post-quantum assessments that we're doing for clients today, both in the federal regulated, state, local, and also commercial space. So you need to start building a cryptographic inventory, map all usages, all those kind of things, which doesn't sound like fun, but you have to do it. If you're not doing it now, it's going to really hurt you if you don't do it before. So I talked about the post-quantum cryptography, PQC. You need to adopt the NIST standards now. It's very important. We've helped a lot of clients sort of get ready for that and to go down that process. It's something that if you're not doing today, you need to be doing. So please go there. And then there's the hybrid transition. You're going to be running classical and PQC at the same time. So you've got to have a plan for that and a strategy so that when quantum does hit, you're ready and you have that transformation model put in place. And then governance and testing, update your policies, run quantum aware drills. We used to talk about tabletop drills. We're now going to talk about AI-driven scenarios where we're using simulated and real-time data to test these quantum aware drills. We need to run them constantly, and we're going to be having to do those more and more. And it obviously comes into an integrated approach. So migration is going to take years due to the legacy complexity and other things. But I think start with high value, long-lived data, and I think at that point you're then just getting ready for what's coming. So you'll be ready when it finally hits.
Great. Thanks, Stu. Excellent insights. And again, we'll catch up with you as we get into our round robin segment later on. But for now, let's turn to government agencies, where this year's trends focus on the core systems and processes that keep the government running. One of the most powerful new tools in that operational toolbox is AI, but adoption remains uneven. With many agencies still stuck in pilot mode, Shannon, what do you see as the biggest barriers to operationalizing AI across government? What are you seeing from your clients and those that you speak to?
Yeah, John, I'm glad we're starting here because this is one of the most consequential issues shaping government effectiveness today. I think we see real enthusiasm across agencies for the potential of AI to modernize mission delivery, streamline operations, and reduce workforce burden. But enthusiasm hasn't fully translated into scale. And there are a few persistent barriers slowing the shift from pilot programs to enterprise-wide adoption. I was glad to hear from Stu, though, that we might be meaningfully moving out of the pilot purgatory, as he said. But some of those barriers have been, first, data readiness continues to be the biggest hurdle. Many agencies are still dealing with fragmented, outdated, or siloed legacy systems. And without trusted, well-governed data, AI models will struggle to perform or scale safely. Agencies recognize this, which is why we're seeing increased investment in foundational data modernization and shared data platforms. I think the second is there are governance and risk concerns, and rightly so. Agencies operate in a high-stakes environments, and leaders are cautious about deploying models that could introduce new operational, ethical, or security risks. The progress we're seeing is in the maturing of AI governance structures, clearer accountability models, playbooks for responsible use, and standardized pathways for testing and approving solutions. One quick example is that Guidehouse is supporting a law enforcement agency which wants to introduce AI tools into its operating and technical environment in ways that are consistent with its IT governance policies and in ways that support existing application and tool-specific ATOs. What we have learned is that compared to even 12 or 18 months ago, agency CIOs are more willing to tailor policies to accommodate new AI tools, and AI tool providers are being more transparent and collaborative with technology organizations to help them reach a comfort level with these new tools. So in short, the policies and the tools are moving closer to each other. And then third, workforce readiness. We've talked about this already today. It's a really often underestimated barrier. Teams need both technical skills and comfort with integrating AI into their daily processes. Agencies that succeed treat this as a change agility journey, as we've mentioned, training teams and redesigning workflows to augment, not replace their people. Gaps in organization and workforce readiness, uneven ability to evaluate, deploy, and oversee AI are some key constraints, especially with limited capacity and decision-making structures. But with proper workforce readiness and change agility, AI tools can amplify human performance. And as Stu mentioned earlier, there's a real opportunity to create excitement.
Great, Shannon. I'm going to shift gears a little bit here because another interesting trend that was noted in our report was sort of the intersection of national security and energy. And Chris touched on this a little in his section. So after I get your response, I'm going to have him chime in as well. Specifically, the idea of nuclear-powered data centers to support mission-critical AI. It's still early days, but what's your take on this emerging conversation? And what questions should agency leaders be asking now to prepare for what's ahead?
Yeah, I think that the speed at which national security conversations are converging with energy infrastructure planning has really exceeded expectations. It's moving very quickly. It's really signaling how quickly compute resilience is becoming a strategic priority for AI-driven missions. And I think while many may only see an energy or data center trend, it also reflects a national security shift. Mission owners are confronting compute demands that exceed what civilian grids can reliably support for defense, intelligence, and continuity of government workloads. And nuclear enabled compute offers hardened, sovereign, and resilient power, really critical for operations in contested environments or where persistent compute is a strategic asset. I think in terms of some of the key questions that leaders should be asking now, it's who owns and governs the data and the metadata, what regulatory and safety frameworks are needed for these new critical infrastructure owners and operators, what are the geopolitical and public trust implications, how do we evolve expectations of the new roles between these owner operators, regulators, and security agencies given the changing threat environment? I think the real task for 2026 is preparing governance, partnerships, as we've talked about before, and risk frameworks early, even before the technology is deployable at scale. As we discussed earlier, there's a real imperative for partnerships across the public and private sectors. Chris, I know you have some additional perspectives also.
I agree with everything you're saying, Shannon, and I think the one of the unique things about the way Guidehouse sort of organizes is that our practice that works with energy providers also works with state and local governments and with national policymakers, because we know that those are the things that come together to drive quality of life within communities. And obviously, as Shannon's mentioning, the sort of demands for data, not only in the commercial space but in the government space, are calling out for new sources of energy like nuclear. But what you're also seeing is that the all kinds of non-traditional players are entering the nuclear space, and that I think is a really interesting and exciting opportunity, but it needs to be managed and governed by policymakers, because we've gone from a period of time where nuclear was kind of a third rail to now where it's something that is the opposite. And the reality of it is it's going to need to be managed and governed effectively by in conjunction with policymakers, energy providers, and consumers as well. And I think that one thing that strikes me is that we tend to get very, very sort of pulled into the conversation of the moment. But we have to remember that these changes take a lot of time, and it's very likely that political winds will change and shift before this transition is fully realized. And so taking a longer view about the role that we need nuclear to play in our energy infrastructure, and understanding that it's not going to be all of it, but it's going to be an important part of it, and creating a regulatory framework that embraces that is going to be really important. And I think we've seen a shifting position with the Department of Energy in recent months. We've seen state regulators sometimes step in and fill in for that, and we've seen energy providers themselves and non-traditional entrants get into the nuclear space as well. I think that all of those things are always going to be a part of it, and are going to need to come together in a way that balances out the push for more energy, but also the demand to do it safely. I think that is going to be a sort of a guiding principle across all of this, and that's one of the ways that by bringing all these kind of groups together, our practice is able to help drive some of those conversations.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Chris. And I think, as we talked about at the outset, one of our 4 focus areas that emerged in our trends analysis was around partnerships. And I can't think of a clearer example of where new partnerships are building between corporate entities, governments, state at every level, nonprofit organizations, and it's really fascinating to see how that unfolds. Great. Well, thanks for that, both of you. We're going to switch over now and take a deeper dive into healthcare. AI also features prominently in our healthcare trends report and is described as being ubiquitous right now in areas like health apps, clinical workflows, diagnostics, and more. John, can you talk about the most impactful AI use cases that are emerging across healthcare from your vantage point?
Sure, thanks, John. And you used the word ubiquitous. We use the word ubiquitous in our report. You only have to look at your wrist, where you see your Apple Watch or your Fitbit, or your finger, where you see your Aura Ring, to get a sense for the personalization of healthcare. But beyond that, even the large AI companies, ChatGPT or Claude or Google, are now creating health-centric apps so that you can take data about yourself, load it into those apps, and get guidance on clinical and wellness information at your fingertips. That, you know, it's a new frontier, things we've never had before. In fact, it was just a few short years ago that electronic medical records were kept on paper, meaning prior to them being electronic. Now they're electronic, and you can couple electronic medical record information with personalized health information, which is giving patients, you and me, and clinicians the opportunity to be much more precise in the way they interact with one another. It allows patients to ask clinicians questions. It allows clinicians to be more specific in some of the treatment that they're prescribing. So, you know, that's a clear trend toward ubiquitousness. When I move over, though, into the administrative side of healthcare, one of the most administratively complex and expensive processes in the industry is the process that takes place between hospital systems that are creating bills and sending those to health insurance companies. So there's this dynamic where everybody's trying to get it right, but because of the complexity of the system, it makes it very difficult. So you've got a small army of people on the hospital system side, a small army of people on the health insurance company side, and that traditional friction has now turned into a battle of the AI bots, where each of the two parties is trying to make a convincing argument as to why they're right. Ultimately, I think what that's going to lead to is less friction in the system and a very significant reduction in the labor costs associated with sending out bills or paying claims. As the systems, as the bots that are trying to adjudicate these processes become more and more efficient, you're going to see lower friction in the system versus higher, and a tremendous savings in terms of labor cost. And
well, John,
what's great about
to ask you a question on that, will that lead to improved customer experience for the patient, or is that to be seen if that friction decreases between the hospital systems and the insurance industry?
It's certainly going to lead to less friction for the patient. I mean, all of us have experienced a situation where we're trying to get a claim processed and a bill paid, and it requires a lot of intervention with you calling 1-800 numbers and talking to customer service reps. So I think we're going to see a lot of that go away. But that's in the administrative space. I mean, in the clinical domain, you're also seeing use cases for AI grow very, very rapidly. The most notable one is in the space of ambient listening, where there's a very, very fast-moving trend for clinicians to use ambient listening in a clinical setting to populate a health record. So the days of going to see your doctor and having your doctor stare at their PC while they're trying to administer care to you is on the decline. Actually, what they're going to do is has a much more personalized interaction, and the medical record will populate behind the scenes. Or if you're a nurse working in a clinical setting, you're either using or will be using tools like remote patient monitoring, which are giving you alerts and keeping you attuned to some of the needs that some of your patients are going to have in their rooms. So you can see there's both administrative improvements on the way and a lot of clinical improvements on the way as well. I guess the third trend, go ahead, John.
No, I'll say that's fascinating. Yeah, please go on, John.
Yeah, a third trend that I had mentioned is what's going on with our life sciences clients. Stuart mentioned hyper personalization inside the financial services domain. We do a lot of work with life sciences companies that are trying to introduce new products into the market. And for the first time, they're going to be able to hyper personalize those products to specific patient needs, which is to say that doctors need to be trained in what to prescribe, and individuals, patients need to be trained in how to use them. And now we can get much more hyper personalized in terms of the way we do that. So I think there's customer impacts, administrative cost impacts, clinical savings and efficiencies that you're going to see take place across the healthcare domain.
Thanks, John. Another interesting healthcare trend that we identified this year is about coordination becoming the engine of access. For rural and at-risk communities, this feels particularly urgent. I know you and your team have done quite a bit of work around this topic. What are some of the most promising examples you're seeing that are expanding access for these populations?
Well, I think everybody's familiar with the rural program that the federal government has established to get money into the hands of some of these rural systems. And if you think about the way that's going to unfold, there's money coming from the federal government to the states, and then from the states ultimately down to some of these rural care providers. They are naturally going to take advantage of some of the technology and AI trends in the industry in order to apply to get the grants, and then also in order to create more access for people at rural locations. So I think that's something that's in its infancy that we're going to continue to see evolve and emerge over the next several years.
Great. Thanks, John. Okay, the part everybody's been waiting for, we're moving on to the round robin section here. And the overall topic is, what should leaders watch next? I'm going to push a couple questions out to my colleagues and get their reactions. I'll start going to Shannon and then Stu on which indicators should leaders be monitoring closely as this year unfolds?
I think, first of all, signals of strain in foundational government systems like procurement, back office, HR, IT, where modernization pace will dictate the mission readiness and resilience. I think also really looking at acceleration of AI governance maturity, including increased leadership emphasis, decisions, and investment. Also, zero trust implementation progress, adoption of standard platforms that reduce duplication and risk, and adoption by the workforce that we've talked about. Also, changes in the security threat landscape will both challenge our current processes and structures and give us reasons to accelerate our AI maturity. Also, there are changes by our nation state and criminal adversaries, which may result in our need to rethink where and how to balance implementation risks. I think also adding to the complexity is that, of course, our adversaries are themselves using AI and other technologies to move faster, no longer relying on the same tradecraft, and we'll need to rethink how we can use these new tools to match their velocity of change.
Great. Stu, some thoughts from you on this one?
Yeah, and I'm going to give a techie answer. I know you're shocked by that, John. But I think for me, I think what leaders need to understand is the tech doesn't stay in tech anymore. And what I mean by that is AI has been prompts, right? That's what we've been working with today. I think we talked about agentic. What we're seeing the change, and I think leaders need to pay attention to, is the idea of the orchestrated digital worker alongside the human worker. You've heard the term open claw, Nemo claw, Claude Cowork, all those kind of things that are happening. What we're starting to see is this synergy between digital and human in a way that actually feels very natural to the human and will feel very natural to the employees in the organization. So I think one of the things we need to think through, when we talk about 26, we're getting outside of the world of pilots. This is going to be where we're going to see value created rapidly and the intelligence side of the organization really be unlocked. And for those workers and those folks in organizations that really get excited about it, you're going to see an amazing amount of enthusiasm. So back to what I was talking about earlier, I think number one is you need to make sure that you're painting a positive vision and providing that information and tools to people, but don't make it a tech thing. It's an organizational thing. And I think, in the first 2 months of this year, we have seen, I think 3 years of innovation, way more than we saw in the last 2 years when it came to AI in that area, which is organizational coordination between digital and human. But when I talk about generative AI, I know I talk to boards and C-suites and others. The thing I say is the generative part is the human, right? AI will take on some of those tasks that we do, but I think the idea of how it makes the humans more valuable and driving more insight, whether it's a regulation, whether it's defense, whether it's finance, whether it's energy provider, no matter what your role is, I think leaders need to really be looking at that piece to say, do I know enough? Do we have a strategy? I got pulled into many a boardroom to say, hey, what should we be thinking about in AI? And that first thing I always say to them, it's a change conversation, not a tech conversation. I think that's the big piece I think people need to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'll just foot stomp that. I mean, change champions at all levels, critical to this, and get comfortable with AI as a teammate, not as a threat. And so we'll go on to the next item. Okay, next question. I'm going to throw this one to John and Chris. What second order impacts may not be obvious yet, but could become significant later in the year? John, start with you, and then we'll get Chris's thoughts on that.
Well, John, you just mentioned change. Stuart mentioned digital worker, human worker. I think the second order impact that we're going to see, or one of the second order impacts, is the change to organizations' operating models, job designs, reporting relationships, skill definition. So if we just take the early trends that we've seen as it relates to AI's impact on organizations, and then in your mind's eye, just imagine those expanding across the enterprise, it's going to be a radically different operating model, organization structure than the ones we have today. So I think that's the second order impact that we're going to see coming in the next wave.
Great. Chris?
I think, since I work with energy providers and local governments, I think one of the things to really keep an eye on is the reaction of regular folks to AI and how that changes, because we talk about the proliferation of data centers. Those have real implications on communities, and it has real implications for policymakers and governors. You have a governor's race in Ohio, for example, and Ohio has been one of the most aggressive places at building out data centers. That's seeing how that interplay works and how it comes together, because as I said earlier, people have a say in this, and elections have a way of forming a venue for them to have a say. I think sort of similarly, I have younger kids, I'm sure many of you do too. AI is not exactly a word that makes a phrase that makes them very happy. Like there's a reaction to it that certain people have, this sort of loss of authenticity. And I think one of the things that we're going to see as this technology evolves, and Stu mentioned this a little bit as well, is how do you keep authenticity with your customers, with your residents, with your citizens? How do you keep that authentic connection as these tools come online? I think the conversation is about to get very heated on this topic as we head into a big election, and I think that's going to be one that policymakers and business leaders are going to have to engage with.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Okay, and last question here, ask for some quick responses so we can jump to some Q&A before we wrap. I'm going to throw this to Stu and then Shannon. What's one area where organizations can't afford to wait and should take action now?
I think it goes back to what I said in the first question, John. It gets down to the idea of change when it comes to digital adoption. I think that's number one. You can't wait. You need to have a strategy. You need to build an optimist plan in the organization of what that's going to mean. Find those change agents, as you said, within the organization. I think that's number one. Write it down, do it today.
Great. Shannon?
Okay, very similar. I think that agencies have to act now to modernize the back office, procurement, finance, HR, and cloud infrastructure. These are parts of the agencies that have been under strain for a long time. They must be able to move faster, more consistently. And back to partnerships, I think that the CIO, in partnership with mission leadership, will really create the new structures that are needed.
Terrific. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, Stu, John, and Chris. Okay, now we're going to go on to our final poll. Which area below would you like deeper insight on in the future? A pop-up box will come up on your screen. Take a minute to respond to that, and then we'll hit some Q&A before we wrap the session. All right, so our responses are in, and they're fluctuating. So, wow. All right, it looks like we have a sort of close data between expanding AI pilots into core workflows and measuring the ROI of transformation initiatives. We'll be sure to take this into consideration as we put out future content and share with this group. But before we wrap, I'd like to hit a couple questions if we could. Looking ahead, which of the trends feel significantly urgent to address by mid-year? Who wants to take that question? Obviously, we've talked about a lot of stuff today. I think we covered a lot of ground, but where do you feel that significant urgency must be taken on some of the trends by mid-year? Otherwise, organizations will have real impact.
I'll go first, John, real quick. I think back to the organizational framework or where you're going when it comes to adopting technology and change within your organization. I think if I just put change, right? It's going to be coming at you rapidly. We talked about that early on. And I think understanding what the change adoption curve means in your organization. I love what you said about finding those change agents within your organizations. They're the ones that are going to help tell the story. That's the thing I would say by mid-year, you've got to have it, because everything we talk about after that, in all the industries, the tech and everything else, is change, right? And whether there's big bang or iterative, understand how your organization can absorb that so you don't get into a fear model, and also just put a plan in place and find those change agents.
Thanks, Stu. Okay, if you had to name one thing leaders should stop doing in 26, I think a lot of times we talk about what should people do right away. To make room for what matters, what would it be? What should leaders stop doing in 2026? Anyone want to take that one?
I'm going to say sorry, Shannon, I have any degree of resistance to what's coming. It's a technological sea change that's going to lead to behavior change in the workforce. And we've seen this movie a number of times over the last several decades. This is just the latest incarnation of technology change.
Shannon?
My answer is similar. So stop the fear. Let's embrace the excitement. There's amazing potential.
Got it. I'm going to throw this one to Chris and Shannon. Do you have any best practices or model examples of local governments that are doing things right with this digital transition, particularly related to disaster preparedness and resilience? I know there's a lot there, but any quick reactions to where you've seen some best practices out there?
Can start. There are a ton of them, and I don't want to sort of favor any of my clients over the other. I love them all dearly. San Jose, city of San Jose, is a really great example of a community that has woven in governance structures, public decision making, and kind of a technology path forward. They've obviously themselves faced a lot of natural disasters, themselves, and so they have a very innovative governance model that allows them to sort of be very close to what people are feeling, but also still manage change. That's one that has always impressed me, and I think that the notion of best practices is kind of, it's maybe a little bit too extreme of a way to say it, but you do see certain states like Florida, for example, taking a real sense of ownership around the importance of managing disasters and being proactive about it, and not only reacting and waiting for the federal government to come in and help them. And I think that's sort of a kind of a perspective that I think would be helpful for a lot of states to adopt, understanding the shifting flows of things and recognizing that, disasters and sort of exigent events are things that, the states themselves really need to be driving the sort of preparedness and response to, and not taking sort of a backseat and waiting for them to happen.
And I'll just add to that a thought about there are a lot of emergency management tools that are AI enabled that have been developed. And I think I see that state, local governments are really embracing those tools, feel like that's providing them a real leverage, right? Not replacing people, but providing real leverage for them to be able to be prepared, but then also to help them to respond and recover after disasters.
Great. Well, thank you so much to the panelists. I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 30 seconds here. Some really rich discussion across all the different industry segments here. A central message from the discussion: leaders who monitor indicators early and act proactively are better positioned to reduce risk and build resilience. This panel emphasized that from the second order effects, sector specific pressures, emerging technology inflection points, and how to help organizations stay ahead of disruption rather than react to it. So I want to thank everybody for joining on behalf of Guidehouse. Thank you again for your time and attention to this. As a reminder, a recording of our webinar will be shared with all the attendees via email. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with questions. We hope you have a great day. And thanks again to the panelists.